Hello, horror lovers. Today I've prepared a very interesting and frightening story from Reddit for you. Make yourselves comfortable and enjoy. Pleasant listening. I found the bunker of a survivalist family that disappeared 3 years ago. Dr. Daniel Vienes was a smart man, perhaps too smart for his own good. For 40 years, he taught hydrodynamics, his mind shaped by equations, forms, and numbers. No one knows exactly why, but one day, following a sudden impulse, he calculated the apocalypse, and came to a deeply unsettling conclusion. He never shared what, exactly, he had discovered. But considering that he immediately resigned from his job and sold off his many assets, it's safe to say the result was far from reassuring. His wife was drawn into this radical upheaval as well, a 24-year-old graduate student who had fallen for Daniel not long before. She loved this strange, bear-like man who could just as easily build a log cabin as explain the intricacies of an asteroid's orbit. Talking to Daniel always left people with the strong impression that he was right. So when he told her what he planned to do, she agreed. 15 years and 5 children later, the Vienes were living deep in the woods near my hometown. They were mysterious, incredibly wealthy, and took their survivalist lifestyle extremely seriously. But they were also friendly, easy to talk to, and endlessly fascinating. Unusual survivalists who would burst into town with strange requests that local businesses found oddly exciting. Massive amounts of cement, iron, lead, and steel were transported through remote mountain roads so the Vienes could build their shelter. The advanced methods they used to keep it secret became legendary. At one point, Daniel spent 6 months obtaining the license required to drive heavy trucks to the site himself, just so no one else would ever see the location. In another instance, when a company refused to provide vehicles without GPS trackers, he simply bought the entire fleet outright, leaving them no choice. So when, during the pandemic, the family stopped appearing in town, when requests for food and supplies ceased and all communication went silent, most people blamed it on quarantine. They had a bunker. They had spent their entire lives preparing for self-sufficiency in the face of civilization's collapse. Even Alexander, the youngest at just 3 years old, already gathered firewood as part of his duties and was learning to identify edible local plants. Most of us assumed that if anyone could survive COVID without batting an eye, it would be the Vienes. We were wrong. When the worst finally came to light, we learned that Daniel had used the pandemic as a pretext for a full rehearsal. The family planned to spend 6 months in isolation, essentially stress-testing their fallout bunker. 3 months in, the sheriff received a distress signal over the radio. Coordinates were transmitted in the quiet voice of a crying child, believed by many to have been Alexander, though this was never officially confirmed. Police arrived to find the bunker still sealed. It took rescuers hours to force the door open. Throughout that time, attempts were made to contact the family inside, without success. When they finally entered, officers were stunned. There was no one to save. No bodies. No survivors. There was evidence that the door's locking mechanism had failed, trapping the family inside with no way out. But if that was the case, where did they go? Beds and bunks were still there, covered with moldy yellow sheets. Buckets sat nearby, surrounded by dark stains. Some doors had been barricaded shut, others smashed to splinters. There were even signs of improvised quarantines, and, in places, what looked like violence. The police, usually an excellent source of gossip, remained silent until the town demanded answers. The sheriff was forced to release only the vaguest information. A waterborne illness had spread among the Vienes shortly after they became trapped inside and were unable to seek help. Rumors of infection were exaggerated, fueled by the unrelated rise in COVID cases. Whatever contaminant killed the Vienes, it was not organic in origin. There was no reason to panic. The family's relatives were notified. The bunker was scheduled for demolition. And we were told we could finally put this terrible tragedy behind us. Of course, questions remained. Thousands of them. Why didn't the family call for help? They had radios, computers, smartphones. They were survivalists, not Amish. And where were they? What happened to their bodies? Why didn't they just leave? We shouted these questions at town meetings, but the police refused to comment. For most of us, the unease lasted another week or two, until we realized that answers were not coming anytime soon. And with the pandemic in full swing, most people had other things to worry about. The tragic story slowly faded with time, until it became just one of those terrible things in the town's history that no one talked about. I was as guilty as everyone else of simply forgetting it. I certainly didn't expect to find the bunker in the forest, with faded police tape hanging from a door left wide open and scorch marks around the lock. It stood out among the trees as if someone had cut a hole straight through the fabric of reality itself. The darkness inside was so deep, so absolute, that it was almost painful to look at. My heart sank into my stomach. The place radiated suffering. That made sense. I think some primitive part of my brain picked up on details that only became obvious once I stepped closer. Bloody fingerprints smeared across the handle where someone had desperately, futilely clawed at the lock. The tiny viewing window had been smashed with a hammer that still lay nearby. One glance was enough for me to imagine the family members standing there one by one, screaming into the forest, praying for rescue. Under any other circumstances, I would have run. But I was there looking for my dog. My flashlight caught several wet paw prints leading down into a dusty concrete tunnel. Ripley, half Bernese mountain dog, half collie, the kind of dog who shakes in my arms when storms batter the windows, who needs his paws held while we brush him. I love him. I don't have many relatives. No wife. Not many friends either. But I have Ripley. And I couldn't turn around and go back to my empty apartment just to cry myself sick with grief. He was my dog. I'd raised him from a puppy. I wasn't leaving him in that forest. So I followed him. I didn't know what to expect, only that it wouldn't be anything good. If the police didn't want this place to be found, they hadn't just kept the worst details secret, they'd lied. The bunker hadn't been demolished. It hadn't even been sealed. In fact, judging by the scattered blue latex gloves and a couple of broken police flashlights, it looked like the last people inside had left in a hurry. Considering that 7 people supposedly died here, I assumed someone would have cleaned the place out. But the corridor looked almost untouched. Just a few meters from the entrance, the walls began to fill with frantic writing, desperate scribbles left behind like modern cave paintings. Most of it revolved around escape, diagrams, schematics, equations, formulas. Everything focused on the door and the mechanism behind its failed lock. I instinctively assumed they were Daniel's, and that he had been the last to die. What a terrible fate, to outlive your own children. And yet, it only got worse. Gradually, the equations and plans gave way to raw, frantic scrawls. The same phrases repeated over and over. 5 doors. 5, not 6. 6. Too late. Too late. 6 doors. 6. It looked like something torn straight out of an asylum, psychotic rambling, broken only by 6 final paragraphs at the very end. Each letter there was perfectly neat. Each short paragraph was crowned with a carefully drawn Christian cross. Elliot Veens, 15 years old. A gifted guitarist. He liked boys, though he thought I didn't know. I loved him with everything I had. He would have been a great man. Alicia Veens, 14 years old. She loved drawing and shooting. She had a mother's hardness. It would have served her well in life. Eli Veens, 8 years old. The smartest of all of us. These were Daniel's memorials to his family. Seeing those words illuminated by my flashlight felt like a horrifying intrusion into the all-consuming despair he must have endured. He must have realized he'd never get the chance to speak at their funerals. Never write their obituaries. This was his last, desperate attempt to make sure the world might one day know them as he did, as real people. The writing ended near a hatch in the floor. It wasn't open, but the tunnel beyond it ended in a dead end, and Ripley's tracks disappeared right at the hatch. I was afraid he might be in danger. Still, I stopped and looked back at the bunker door 20 meters behind me. The forest, once so oppressive, looked bright now, even on that gray, rainy day. Part of me felt like I was leaving the entire world behind. When I started down the ladder, I entered a large, circular living space packed with furniture and crammed with clever compartments. The walls were lined with fold-out beds and tables. Every inch of the room was multifunctional. The dining area could become a living room, which could become sleeping quarters, which could even be used for exercise, all depending on what you unfolded, detached, or rotated. 7 people living here, tightly packed, with almost no personal space. It made sense, but it was still a large room, bigger than most studio apartments. And several corridors led deeper underground, hinting at the bunker's hidden depths. I looked for signs of my dog and found them quickly. But this far from the rainy grove, Ripley's tracks began to fade. Within just a few meters, they blurred and vanished toward the nearest door. I wanted to rush after him, but forced myself to slow down. It was unlikely Ripley could escape by some other route, and I wouldn't help either of us if I got myself hurt. So I took a moment to look around. I quickly noticed the dining table. If I needed proof that the police hadn't bothered to clean up, this was it. The plates were still there. The food had rotted into a strange, blackened crust. A child's hat lay on one of the chairs, once cream-colored fleece, now sickly green and yellow. The backs of the chairs had been reinforced with wooden beams, carved with long grooves, clearly meant to hold something of a specific width. Each cushion bore foul-smelling stains, disturbingly shaped, almost like impressions of bodies. I touched one with my gloved hand, and the material crackled stiffly. Whatever the substance was, it appeared on the plates and utensils too. Even handprints were visible on the tablecloth. At first I thought it was blood. But it wasn't quite that. The outlines were too sharp. Too defined. On one chair, the stain narrowed exactly where a woman's waist would be, almost like a perfect silhouette. I shuddered, remembering that Miranda Veens had always been a slender woman, and wondered how she had left her shape pressed into the gray fabric. With my flashlight, I noticed the stains appeared in the strangest places. Yes, some were on beds and blankets, and even on patches of bare floor, as you might expect in a room full of sick people. But why did one stain on the floor so clearly resemble a child curled in the fetal position? And why did the same shapes appear on the TV remote, on books, on shelves, on board games? Everything, from couch cushions to DVD boxes to piles of dirty laundry, was coated in the same dried brownish substance, radiating a horrible metallic smell. One thing puzzled me more than anything else. Someone had set up another table with 4 chairs, all modified with the same reinforced backs as the dining chairs. A jigsaw puzzle lay spread out on it in 4 neat piles. But only one pile had been used. The others looked almost untouched, as if someone had set aside pieces for 3 other people who had no interest in participating at all. Maybe Daniel had tried to keep morale up while the family was sick. God, if that was true, I couldn't help but imagine the poor man sitting there with his dying loved ones, desperately encouraging them to place their puzzle pieces as they slipped in and out of consciousness. Something in that room radiated madness, and the longer I stayed there, sweeping the bright circle of my flashlight from one detail to the next, the more I wanted to leave. One door had been boarded shut with wooden beams. A couch had been partially dismantled. Several beds had been burned. Every light bulb had been unscrewed and neatly placed into a box on the kitchen table. When I looked up at the ceiling, I finally understood why the police had been so certain the Veenses hadn't survived, despite never finding their bodies. Someone had jammed a human finger into one of the empty light sockets, almost as if expecting it to glow when the switch was flipped. What was it about this place that made the police walk away and never return? They hadn't even taken the finger to test it for disease, or at the very least, to identify who it belonged to. I decided it was time to hurry up and find my dog. People had died here. And while I'm not superstitious, I couldn't help thinking that showing a little respect to whatever lingered in a place like this cost nothing. The bunker was cramped and suffocating, and the air reeked so badly that I started to worry I might get sick myself. There was no reason to linger, but I'd never forgive myself if I left Ripley behind to rot down here. It's not like he could climb the ladder and get out on his own, though I still wasn't entirely sure how he'd gotten in to begin with. Gathering what little courage I had left, I called his name, breaking the silence. It felt like a terrible taboo in this cursed place, like shouting in a graveyard. Ripley. I waited, praying to hear the familiar click of his paws. But for a long moment, there was only that kind of silence, the kind that makes you wonder whether someone, or something, is holding its breath in the darkness, trying to pass as just another patch of nothing, waiting for you to finally turn around and show it your back. The television exploded to life with a burst of white noise so loud and sudden that I yelped, threw my hands up, and nearly fell backward onto a rolled-up sleeping bag that looked like it had spent a week in a sewer. By the time I realized what had caused the sound, I was already hearing the tinny, recorded voice of Daniel Veens. I understand the problem. I need to emphasize how little I understand what's happening. I frowned and stepped closer to the screen. It showed a greenish infrared image of the bunker, with Daniel in the foreground and the dining table behind him. The picture was grainy and indistinct, but I could clearly see his family seated in the chairs. Miranda got sick first. Looking back, that makes sense. She was always going into the pantry for cooking supplies, and we found it behind the refrigerators. So what is this? Oh, hell. One of the figures in the background suddenly slumped forward with a loud thud, knocking a plate into the air. Damn it, damn it, damn it, Daniel muttered as he stood, grabbed the woman by the shoulders, and propped her upright again. Miranda never liked my cooking, he snorted, laughing, as he adjusted something on the back of her chair. Rods work much better than duct tape. All those hours I spent strapping them down never worked. But rods, they slide perfectly into the spine. With a small modification, I can just slot them into the chairs. That way everyone can join us for dinner. I'm working on something similar for family game night. Daniel walked up to the camera with a grin and lifted it from the tripod, slowly panning across the dining table. What I saw nearly made me drop my flashlight. His family had been dead for a long time. Sunken faces. Missing noses. Lips pulled back into awful, frozen grins. They were unmistakably corpses. Even through the low resolution, the only thing that made them seem remotely alive was the way their eyes still reflected the infrared light, glowing faintly in the dark. And yet Daniel seemed completely unaware. He ruffled Elliot's hair. Kissed his wife on the cheek. Ran his hand along the shoulder of one of the girls. He even lifted little Alexander from his high chair. I think he cradled him. I'm not sure, I turned away. I couldn't bear to see the boy up close. When I looked away from the screen, my flashlight drifted back to the real dining table, and I finally understood what those stains were. Not quite blood. But close. Liquefying flesh. Left alone for months, Daniel hadn't buried his family. Instead, he moved their bodies from place to place, posed them like puppets, and lived as if nothing had changed. Looking at where the stains had settled, the picture became horrifyingly clear. He tucked them into bed. He set the table for them. He seated them to watch television or handed them their favorite books. They even sat there, lifeless shells, while Daniel waited for them to finish the damn puzzle. The thought chilled me to the core. Back to work, Daniel's voice continued. This is obviously not part of the original plans. On the other hand, there's no room for it in the blueprints either. Elliot didn't believe me. And why would he? I built every inch of this place, but I didn't install that door in the lower pantry. I checked the cameras and the photos I took during construction. The wall was empty. But now the door is there, and it has to lead somewhere. I don't know when or why it opens. But it does. And next time, I'll be ready. Because I need to know what's on the other side, and why it did this to us. We're alone down here. Often, we're all asleep at the same time. Anyone could have cut our throats and ended it. But that didn't happen. It wasn't in a hurry. And I need to know why. It took our radios, our computers, our phones, one by one. None of us noticed until it was too late. I kept telling the kids they needed to take better care of their things. Even when they complained, I assumed the phones were just behind a shelf somewhere. Where else could they be in a sealed bunker? But it wasn't the children. Looking back, there were so many signs. Who kept taking the light? Who kept draining the batteries from our flashlights? How long did we live with it before we finally realized we weren't alone? Was it here the whole time? A door from nothing, leading to nowhere, at least most of the time. Because I know for certain it doesn't always open onto a blank wall. There is something on the other side. I hear it moving. A wet sound. Labored breathing rattling in its lungs. That horrible noise I hear while wandering these corridors, when it thinks I'm asleep. I listen to Daniel, transfixed by his strangely persuasive rant, when something in the image caught my attention. The infrared camera, filming in total darkness, its picture a boiling mass of static and grain. What was that? I paused the recording and rewound. Squinting, I saw two faintly glowing points in the darkness, just above Daniel's shoulder. Slowly, the image resolved in my mind. I understood what I was seeing, and my blood ran cold. Miranda Veens had turned her head. Her lifeless eyes glowed as she stared at the back of Daniel's skull. There was no point in leaving at this stage. I'm no doctor, but that door emits enough radiation to, well, to kill a family of 7 if no one touched it. Being in the same room is dangerous, but not immediately fatal. Yet given how sick they all became, it's clear that curiosity got the better of them, one by one. They all went too close. Or maybe not. Maybe whatever is on the other side came through and did this. I don't even know. Wait. What was that? Daniel turned toward the camera, and the recording stopped. The frozen frame showed a lone man, blazing like a star in the lens, standing face to face with an unknowable darkness, broken only by 6 pairs of white, glowing eyes. I became painfully aware of my position relative to the dining table, seized by a sickening certainty that if I turned around, those chairs wouldn't be empty. I would see the Veenses. All of them. And Daniel too. Waiting for me. Heads turned. Bodies left to rot for years in the dark. Something moved behind me. It was breathing, loud, fast. I knew what it was. I knew. It lunged so suddenly that when I felt something hot and wet brush my arm, I screamed, only for it to recoil instantly. Then, without hesitation, it leapt at me and knocked me to the floor. I started crying when Ripley licked my face. He was shaking, and worse than that, he was silent. That wasn't normal. He was never a quiet dog. He always greeted me, always got excited. But whatever he had seen down here, he pressed himself against me and dug his paws into my shoulders, as if begging me to pick him up. It had been years since the last time he'd done that. He was too big now. "You absolute idiot," I whispered, my voice breaking, and even in the dark, I could feel his tail wag. Jokes aside, I felt nothing but overwhelming relief at finding him. "Let's get the hell out of here." I lifted him, straining under his weight, ignoring my aching muscles, and headed for the ladder. Climbing the 3 or 4 rungs up to the hatch wasn't easy, but I managed and shoved it. First with one hand. Then both. Again and again, with all my strength. The hatch didn't budge. Damn it! I yelled, pounding my fists against it, earning nothing but pain in my wrists. It was jammed. The handle had somehow been snapped clean off. I'd need bolt cutters or something similar to sever the metal rod locking it shut. My fingers couldn't move it. I couldn't force it open. The rod was about an inch thick. I'd need tools to reach it from this side. At least that's fixable, I thought, climbing back down and catching my breath. On one wall, I noticed a simple chalk diagram of the bunker. It had 3 levels. The lowest was labeled pantry. Daniel had mentioned it earlier, and it was crossed out with a large red X. The top level was marked living quarters, where I now stood. But the middle level was labeled workshop. That's where I'd find what I needed. One door opened onto a concrete stairwell. Standing at the top, I shone my flashlight down along the spiral railing, unsure what I expected to see. Only harsh shadows. And the sense of something foul rising into the air. A smell that tickled my throat and burned faintly in my lungs. Had the police even come down this far? Had they seen what I saw on that television, or had they simply left? For some reason, I doubted that alone would have been enough to make an entire sheriff's department run. So it had to be something else. Something terrifying enough to send dozens of armed men fleeing. Something that was almost certainly down there. The door. I descended quietly. At first, I considered leaving Ripley behind, but after losing him once, I decided I'd rather risk it than not know where he was. Besides, he was quieter than I was, and I had no desire to go down those stairs alone. He followed me with nothing but the soft click of his paws on concrete, a sound I found deeply comforting as I struggled to keep my flashlight steady and my breathing even. One level down, I found the workshop exactly as I'd expected. A massive space filled with generators, fuel and water tanks, boilers, heaters, everything needed for survival, but impossible to remove due to contamination. Wires, pipes, and tubing crisscrossed the room. And even after all these years, most of the machines still hummed in the pitch-black darkness. That thought unsettled me deeply. Scanning the harsh industrial shapes rising from floor and wall, I shuddered, then quickly spotted a smaller area Daniel had sectioned off for himself. About a fifth of the room. A large workbench. Serious, high-end machining equipment. Daniel had clearly spent a lot of time here. Lathes. Table saws. Drills. Belt sanders. Welding torches. Everything a man would need to build anything himself. And Daniel had been building something. I wasn't sure what, until I saw the hand. It lay atop a stack of papers, long since darkened to a sickly brown, as if soaked in nicotine-stained saliva. On the board was a faded, but still visible, diagram that looked like a ball joint. I thought of duct tape. Of Daniel's small mechanical system to keep his family upright. Then I looked at the hand and fought back the urge to vomit. I don't know whether Daniel had been working on articulated limbs, or simply on a way to reassemble decaying remains once they began to fall apart. But the size of the hand suggested a teenage child. And he had left it there, like a disassembled watch. It was missing a finger. How far gone did you have to be? I pinched my nose with one hand and began rummaging through boxes with the other, searching for heavy-duty bolt cutters, or maybe a hacksaw. Ripley backed away from the noise, but once I was sure he wasn't going anywhere, I kept going. Box after box. Anything that could break that damn metal rod. Eventually, I found bolt cutters. A crowbar. Heavy pliers. I pocketed one. Slung another over my shoulder. Gripped the third in my fist. Too large to hide, but the bolt cutters felt solid in my hand. And somehow, that helped. But the feeling didn't last. Something shifted in the darkness ahead. In the tangled jungle of shadows cast by pipes and cables running from one machine to another, a figure moved, thin, but unmistakably human in outline. I couldn't help remembering what I'd seen on that recording. Could it really have been true? Maybe Daniel had staged something. Fishing line. A motor. Something crude. Maybe the idea that those bodies were moving on their own was too much to accept. After all, I couldn't be sure, could I? It was a comforting thought, one my mind clung to out of pure panic. That was when I saw them. A pair of white points, reflecting from deep within the cluttered room. Ripley, already behind me with his head pressed against my leg, pushed closer and let out the faintest whimper, the sound of a dog utterly terrified, on the verge of losing control. Just metal, I told myself, as the light shook so badly in my hand that I could barely see. Just two shiny pieces of metal. They blinked. And began to move toward me. Any remaining doubt vanished when a pale white hand slid into the beam of my flashlight. I sprinted for the stairs and tried to climb, but after only a few steps, I saw something clench the railing above. A moldy lump of flesh, barely recognizable as a fist. The flesh had shriveled so badly the fingers were almost nothing but bone. Instinctively, I raised the light and saw a swollen, hairless face staring down at me. I couldn't tell whether it was a teenage girl or 60-year-old Daniel. Either way, I turned, and saw another body limping toward me from the workshop. I was trapped. Nowhere to go. When I felt warm liquid on the back of my leg, I realized Ripley had finally lost control. A full-grown dog, tail tucked, shaking like a puppy, desperate to be picked up. God. I just needed him to hold on a little longer. I couldn't carry him, but I couldn't leave him either. With no other choice, I ran downward and burst into the pantry level. For a moment, I was tempted to stop. The air was thicker here, my breathing muffled, distant, as if underwater. But one glance upward showed 3 pairs of eyes staring down at me. So I bolted down the corridor and threw open a random door. Inside was what looked like a storage room. Most of the shelves had been overturned, food left to rot on the floor. But 1 or 2 shelving units still stood, stacked with tall, opaque crates, perfect cover. That's where I decided to hide. I pulled Ripley with me into the darkest, quietest corner I could find. That's when I noticed the door. At first glance, it almost looked normal. I understood why Daniel must have been confused, it resembled the others. But it was different. Too tall. Too wide. Raised half a meter off the floor. And the metal was completely rusted, aged far beyond everything else. Wet moss clung thickly around the frame, the kind you'd find on trees in a swamp. Every few seconds, something strange and oily seeped from the door, like runoff from a parking lot after rain. That alone would have been odd enough. But the seepage flowed horizontally, defying gravity. Each time, a thick glob crossed the room and slapped against the opposite wall, forming a human-sized puddle that made no sense at all. Remembering Daniel's words about radiation, I instinctively backed away, dragging Ripley with me, pressing into the farthest corner, praying he wouldn't give us away. I switched off the flashlight. I must have taken longer than I thought, because within seconds, figures entered the room. In total darkness, I couldn't see them, but they made enough noise for me to know at least 2 had followed me in. I stood frozen, blind, waiting, unsure whether they were coming straight for me or simply passing through, forced to let luck decide my fate. When something scraped along the wall less than half a meter from where I stood, I broke. I turned on the flashlight. Daniel Veens was less than 6 inches from my face. "Get out," he hissed through a toothless, cracking mouth. A living corpse like the others, but somehow, in his wide, terrified eyes, something remained. Then I heard it. The door creaking open. I swung the light toward the wall and saw it, opening. And beyond the rusted steel was not bare concrete. It was far worse. A raging throat of flesh. A circular tunnel of pulsing muscle lined with palm-sized teeth. A spiraling descent into madness. Hot, rancid air burst into the room, washing over me and the rotting bodies alike. We were all paralyzed by the sight, those of us who still had eyes to see. "What the hell?" I whispered, unable to look away. "It's coming," Daniel breathed. He grabbed me and shoved me out of the room. I hit the floor and slid through the slick residue left by the vences, its stench turning my stomach. The worst part was that it was cold. I don't know why, but I had expected it to be feverishly hot. Instead, it soaked into my shirt like filthy rainwater. "It's coming." That voice wasn't Daniel's. It sounded like a child whispering. One by one, the bodies approached the open door and knelt. The others seemed completely gone, but Daniel remained aware. He looked at me one last time before pressing his head to the floor in supplication. "The only thing we did wrong," he said, "was being here for it to torment. It doesn't need a reason. Only an opportunity. Go. It won't let us leave. It won't even let us die. If it catches you, it won't let you go either." His forehead touched the filth. Then something reached through the doorway and closed its hand around his head, the way you or I might pick up an apple. I ran. I grabbed Ripley, the bolt cutters, and sprinted as if my legs were machines, pistons ignoring every signal of pain and exhaustion. I had to move. I had to get out. The image of that hand erased everything else from my mind, painfully, completely. I reached the top level and nearly collapsed, but forced myself up, crawled to the ladder, climbed, and began cutting the metal rod. Doing it one-handed was hell. The other hand clutched the flashlight, which I kept swinging toward the doorway behind me. I stumbled too many times. The light fell. "No, no, no," I muttered. "No time." I couldn't see, but I could hear something climbing the stairs. Not footsteps. Faster. Like a spider. Something with too many limbs, skittering across floor, walls, ceiling, hauling itself forward, a shape that would offend God himself. I leaned into the bolt cutters with everything I had. The rod snapped. I threw open the hatch. Moonlight flooded in. Ripley stood at the base of the ladder, snarling uselessly at the doorway. I scooped him up and scrambled out so fast my muscles turned to jelly. I collapsed on all fours, but I was outside. Ahead was the long corridor of scribbled walls, and at the far end, the doorway, crowned in the tired blue light of a full moon. Ripley needed no encouragement. He tore down the corridor. I followed, stumbling, crawling, finally tumbling through the door and collapsing onto the forest floor. I blacked out for a moment. When I came to and saw the treetops moving above me, branches glowing in moonlight, I breathed. And then froze. Something was gripping my ankle. A hand reached out of the darkness, grabbed me, and slowly began dragging me back underground. Whatever it was, most of its body remained hidden in the shadows beyond the doorway, but the hand crushing my leg was the size of my torso. Its skin looked wrong, like that of a mole stripped bare. I punched it. I clawed at it with my fingernails. I cried, kicked, and screamed, but nothing slowed it down. From behind the door, something resembling a face leaned forward, smiling as it watched me. It wasn't in a hurry, far from it. It pulled me in so slowly that my mind had all the time in the world to understand the nightmare that awaited me. I think if I'd been handed a gun in that moment, I would have used it on myself. I couldn't get Daniel's eyes out of my head, the look on his face as he knelt to worship that thing. The look of someone who knew that hope, pride, joy, anything even faintly good, was so far away it might as well have been a dream. How long had it planned to keep them there? How long did it intend to keep me? I cried like a child, feeling my mind slowly crack as I tried everything to stop being pulled into the shadows. I dug my hands into the dirt, searching for a root, a pipe, anything to hold on to. Nothing. Nothing I did made any difference. I was already more than 30 feet from the doorway when Ripley appeared again. Ripley, the dog afraid of vacuum cleaners, plastic bags, and doors that move on their own. The dog who once froze mid-chase because a particularly bold rabbit stopped and stared back at him. The dog you couldn't even watch horror movies around. He launched himself at that hand as if he were a wolf, like he always had been one. He didn't break the skin, but the pressure was enough. The grip loosened, and I tore my leg free. Unable to stand, I dropped to my knees, grabbed Ripley, and pulled with everything I had. This time, the thing finally bled, its flesh tearing under the force of Ripley's jaws. Together, Ripley and I were released, tumbling backward. I didn't hesitate. I didn't wait, look back, or think. I pressed Ripley to my chest and crawled until I blacked out, maybe half a kilometer. Only when I could no longer see the doorway did I allow myself to collapse face first into the ground and lose consciousness. The doctor said I had pneumonia, which made a certain kind of sense. I might have even believed them, if not for the sheriff's visit, asking strange questions as I lay in bed, half delirious, about what I might or might not have seen. I brushed them off as best I could. I had no interest in chasing that nightmare, real or not, especially while I was struggling to breathe through infection. Honestly, I could understand why the police had done so little to seal that place. Sometimes I think about going back and doing it myself. But to this day, I still have nightmares about being dragged into the darkness behind that door. Not just the bunker door I escaped, but the one below it. What I saw was a kind of madness. And I'm sure of that. I often think about Daniel's words. It doesn't need a reason. Only an opportunity. Somehow, the Veens became that opportunity. Maybe they built their bunker on a ley line. Or on a weak point between dimensions. Or on ground once used for rituals. I'm not sure it even matters. They went into the dark believing it would be a safe place to wait out the world's troubles. But something was waiting for them down there, waiting for a chance to reach a family of 7, to trap them, to strip away everything they had, slowly. I moved away after that. I had to. It wasn't just the memories. It was the shortwave radio I kept in my basement, one my father had given me when I was a boy. I'd forgotten about it. At least until one night I woke to the sound of it spilling white noise into the darkness. And buried deep within that noise was a man's whisper. Barely recognizable. But unmistakably his. Let them go. Let them go. Let them go. Let them go. That's the story for today, guys. So, what did you think? Did you like it? Didn't like it? Let me know in the comments. As for my personal take, honestly, the beginning was really strong. I was genuinely hooked. The setup worked great. The only thing I felt was missing was a clearer explanation of how the dog ended up in the forest in the first place. We understand the protagonist went looking for his dog, but where exactly did he live? Was the forest nearby? It feels like it all took place near a small town, with the forest close enough for the dog to run into. Once he entered the bunker, though, it became really engaging. It even reminded me a bit of Resident Evil 7, especially the found footage vibe with the tapes and the descent into something deeply wrong. If you've played it, you know what I mean. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. That said, the later reveal of the massive otherworldly entity, the giant, mole-like hand and all that, didn't really work for me. Up to the midpoint, I was fully on board. The idea of the family becoming corpse-like, Daniel losing his mind trying to keep them alive, and eventually joining them, that was solid. But once it leaned hard into the Lovecraftian, unknowable entity angle, it lost me a bit. It felt like the author was reaching for something very specific, but didn't quite pull it off, at least in my subjective opinion. Still, if you're watching this, I clearly decided it was worth sharing. Maybe that kind of ending works better for some of you. That's it from me. Good luck to everyone. Take care. And I'll see you in the next video.